Can you imagine seeing something so terrifying it makes you quit your job? This true story from a night nurse reveals the horrors that unfolded during a routine shift, and why it's a night she'll never forget. If you skip this, you'll miss the shocking twist that haunted her every moment. Watch until the end to learn the truth behind the shadows in room 4. Fresh out of nursing school, I never thought I'd end up in a cardiac ICU. It was a 6-bed unit on the top floor of a hospital, overlooking the city's Capitol building. A nice view, but that wasn't much comfort during the 12-hour night shifts. Nights in this place were quiet, for the most part, but the ICU always had an eerie stillness about it. Maybe it was just the nature of the job. I'd been working here for a year, and death wasn't uncommon. You get used to it well, as used to it as anyone can. My patients usually pass peacefully, surrounded by family, but tonight was different. I had just returned from a 2-week vacation, engaged, tanned, and refreshed. I was ready to get back to work. The night started like any other. I got the report from the day charge nurse, who casually mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. She told me room 4 had seen a string of deaths while I was away. Every patient admitted there had died, one after another. That didn't strike me as unusual. This was a cardiac ECU after all. People die. But when she mentioned that a priest was scheduled to bless the room in the morning, I felt a shiver. The room was empty for now, but it would serve as the code bed for the night. By 2 a.m., the call came in. A patient with chest pains was coming up to fill room 4. Routine stuff, nothing exciting. The patient arrived, a man in his 50s, looking much more relaxed than most cardiac patients. His wife, on the other hand, seemed exhausted. I gave her some warm blankets and showed her to the waiting room with cots where she could sleep. The patient settled in and I returned to my station. The quiet rhythm of the night began to set in. Outside, the rain started to tap against the windows, a relaxing sound that always helped me stay calm on nights like this. Around 3:30, I glanced at the monitors. Each room had a camera feed that cycled through on a small screen at the desk. Room 1, fine. Room 2, fine. Room 3, fine. Then room 4, something was off. For a split second, I thought I saw someone in there, but the camera flipped too fast. Maybe his wife had returned without me noticing. I walked down the hall and peeked inside. Empty. Just the patient, sound asleep. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the uneasy feeling lingered as I returned to my station. The rain sounds grew louder, almost drowning out the faint hum of the monitors. I settled back in, watching the screen as the camera cycled through again. Room 1, fine. Room 2, fine. Room 3, fine. Room 4, there it was again. This time I saw it clearly. A figure standing in the corner near the window. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't move from my chair, but the unease wouldn't leave. Something was wrong with room 4, and I wasn't ready to find out what. I sat frozen at my desk, the rain outside now a constant patter against the window. The cameras continued their silent, eerie loop. My eyes were glued to the screen, waiting for room 4 to appear again. When it did, I felt a knot in my stomach. The figure was back, but this time it had moved. It stood a little closer to the patient's bed, still hidden in shadow, just on the edge of the light coming from the hallway. My body tensed, and for a few seconds, I didn't even breathe. There was no mistaking it, something was in there. I jumped up from my seat and rushed down the hall, determined to get to room 4. Maybe the patient had gotten out of bed, I reasoned, though deep down I knew that didn't make sense. When I got to the door, everything was exactly as it had been before. The patient was lying in bed, sound asleep. The room was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. I stepped inside, my heart racing, but the silence was heavy. The air felt thick and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I scanned the room, checked the corners, even peeked behind the curtains, but there was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath and returned to my post. The rain sounds, which I normally found soothing, were no longer relaxing. They seemed to echo in my ears, amplifying the growing dread in my chest. I kept staring at the monitors, willing the cycle to come back around. I wasn't imagining things I couldn't be. When the camera flipped to room 4 again, I gasped. The figure had moved closer. It was now standing at the foot of the bed, still shrouded in shadow. But there was no doubt it was there. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, almost watching. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. This was no ordinary shift, no run-of-the-mill patient case. This was something beyond my experience, something I couldn't explain. I picked up the phone to call the other nurse on duty, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. Before I could press the final number, the patient's monitor alarm went off, shattering the silence. My heart pounded as I rushed back to the room. The overhead system blared. A card is needed in CCU room 4. People started rushing into the hallway responding to the code, but I stood frozen. I made it to the door just as the team flooded the room, surrounding the bed. Doctors and nurses started CPR, slamming meds into the patient's eye, but I couldn't step inside. My eyes darted to the camera monitor again, and there it was, the figure, still in the room. This time, it had moved back to the corner, watching the chaos unfold. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, observing the scene. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. This was no ordinary code blue. Something was horribly wrong, and I could feel it deep in my bones. As the chaos of the code unfolded, I remained paralyzed just outside the door, staring into room 4. The team inside was working frantically, but to me, it felt like time had slowed down. My eyes kept flicking to the corner where I'd seen that shadowy figure, where it still stood, unmoving. I wanted to run, to scream for help, to do anything that would snap me out of this nightmare, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, and my chest tightened with fear. The patient was lying on the bed, unresponsive, while the team pushed meds and continued chest compressions. I could hear the nurse next to me calling out times, her voice calm but strained, while the sound of the rain outside grew louder in my ears. Normally, those rain sounds would be a soothing backdrop to a long shift, like the gentle rhythm of nighttime stories meant to lull you to sleep. But now, they were an eerie soundtrack to the horror unfolding in front of me. Then, something shifted. The figure in the corner, still dark and shapeless, seemed to lean forward, as if watching the patient more closely. I felt a jolt of terror shoot through me, my mind racing through every scary story I'd ever heard, every horror story whispered between nurses during slow shifts. But this wasn't some bedtime story or nighttime narrative. This was real. This was happening, and I was right in the middle of it. I tried to refocus on the task at hand. I was supposed to be helping, but all I could do was watch. The dark figure stood there, completely still, as if it were a silent witness to the life or death struggle happening just feet away. No one else seemed to notice. No one reacted. The doctors, nurses, and techs were all locked in on the patient, unaware of the shadow that had now moved closer to the bed. It stood on the other side, opposite the code team, as if it was waiting. Finally, one of the doctors looked up at the clock and called it time of death. The room went quiet, except for the soft hum of the machines and the sound of rain drumming against the windows. The team slowly began to step away, leaving the room one by one. I watched in horror as the figure lingered a moment longer, then melted into the shadows. It was gone just like that, as if it had never been there. But I knew it had. I had seen it. The silence that filled room 4 after the team cleared out was deafening. My legs felt weak, and my breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. I stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been, its presence still lingering in the air. The rain sounds outside seemed heavier now, almost suffocating. I glanced at the clock, 4:15 a.m. The night wasn't even over, but I knew I couldn't stay. I slowly walked into the room, forcing myself to move. The patient lay there, still and cold, a blanket covering him up to his chest. His wife was standing beside the bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at me, her eyes full of exhaustion and sorrow. I wanted to tell her about the figure, about the horror that had just unfolded in front of us, but I couldn't. What would I even say? That I had seen something I couldn't explain? That a shadow had been watching as her husband's life slipped away? No, there was nothing I could say that would make sense. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. She nodded, wiping her face with a tissue, then bent down to kiss her husband's forehead one last time. As she left the room, I felt a wave of relief. At least she hadn't seen it. Whatever that thing was, it had only been there for me. I hoped she could find some peace, but as for me, I knew this was something I wouldn't shake off easily. I was a nurse, trained to handle the grim realities of life and death, but this was beyond any true horror stories I had ever encountered in my career. I stepped back into the hallway, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone to check the time again. The shift would end soon, and I was counting the minutes. The other nurse on duty came up to me, her face drawn with fatigue. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, but it was a lie. "Yeah, just a rough night." We both knew that wasn't the half of it, but I wasn't about to spill my guts to her. Not now. Not ever. Some stories are too scary to share, even with those who might understand. As I made my way back to the nurse's station, the lights flickered briefly. Just for a second, I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The monitor for room 4 cycled through, showing the empty bed. But just as the screen was about to switch to another room, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the doorway of room 4 watching. My breath caught in my throat as the screen changed, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I left that hospital 2 weeks later. I never spoke about what I saw that night in room 4. Even now, years later, when the rain sounds pick up during a storm, I can't help but remember that night. I wonder if the figure is still there, silently watching as new patients come and go. Or maybe it followed me, waiting for another opportunity to show itself. Whatever it was, you'll never forget it. It's not just a scary tale or a horror story you tell to pass the time, it's real. It's one of those terrifying true stories that you carry with you forever. Ever wondered what terrifying secrets could hide in a snowy landscape? In this video, we dive into a chilling true horror story about an ordinary night that spirals into a nightmare when a snow angel appears outside a quiet office. You might think you're safe at home, but if you miss this shocking tale, you'll never look at winter the same way again. Stay tuned to uncover the eerie laughter that turned a simple shift into a heart-pounding experience. It was a frigid winter night, and I found myself driving to work at the old equipment rental place I had been working at for a few months. The job was straightforward, mostly bookkeeping for a small family-run business that rented out farm equipment. The building where I worked was ancient, nearly a century old, perched on a lonely hill deep in the countryside. I liked working late, partly because no one was around to disturb me, and partly because I could listen to music and relax while getting my work done. The silence, coupled with the isolation, helped me focus. That night, I drove through the light snow that had fallen earlier in the evening. The road leading to the building was deserted, and I could barely make out the tire tracks from one I had driven up earlier in the week. The gate at the bottom of the hill was open, as it always was, and I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. The office was on the second floor, overlooking the long driveway and the gate, with one single orange streetlight casting a dull glow onto the snow below. Once inside, I settled into my routine. The place was freezing, so I kept my coat on and wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee while tapping away at the computer. As I worked, I kept glancing out the window. The way the light reflected off the snow created a strange but oddly beautiful glow, making the night feel eerily peaceful. I put on some music, Fall Out Boy, an old guilty pleasure from my younger days, and let the sound fill the empty room. The quiet outside, paired with the upbeat songs, made it feel like just another routine night, or so I thought. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and went downstairs to use the bathroom. The office had this weird vibe, something about the silence always made me a little on edge, but I chalked it up to the isolation. After a few minutes, I returned to my desk, ready to finish up for the night. I glanced outside again as I had been doing all night, but this time, something was different. Just beneath the glow of the orange light, I saw a large imprint in the snow. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a large dog, but the shape didn't fit. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to make sense of what I was seeing. The imprint was fresh, it hadn't been there when I went downstairs, and the snow had been undisturbed before that. It looked like something, or someone, had rolled around on the ground, but it didn't make sense. The size and shape were all wrong. Still, I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe some large animal had wandered too close to the building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, but from something else, something more primal. I pushed the thought aside and went back to work, telling myself it was nothing, but in the back of my mind, the image of that strange imprint stuck with me, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. What had made that mark, and why had it happened while I was away for just a few minutes? The clock ticked loudly in the stillness of the office as I worked, its sound echoing in the dim light. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided it was time to call it a night. I packed up my things and headed down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The unease from earlier lingered, but I tried to shake it off. The mundane routine of closing up shop should have calmed my nerves. Yet it didn't. I stepped outside into the biting cold, the air crisp and biting, stinging my cheeks. As I reached my SUV, I glanced down at the snow. To my utter disbelief, the imprint had changed. It wasn't just a mark from something rolling around anymore. It was undeniably the shape of a snow angel, perfectly formed. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the large snow angel under the dim light. This wasn't just some random occurrence. Whoever had made this was clearly deliberate about it, and it was too large to be a child's. It had to belong to an adult, someone who had been watching me. My mind raced back to the bathroom break. How could someone have been so close without me noticing? No cars had pulled up. I would have heard them. This was too unsettling. I turned quickly to scan my surroundings. The trees loomed nearby, dark and ominous. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I began to look for footprints in the snow. A single set of prints led away from the scene and toward the woods, trailing off into the darkness. Whoever had made this snow angel had come from the trees, not the road. The unsettling feeling deepened as I recalled how quiet the night had been until that moment. I couldn't shake the fear creeping up my spine. I was just about to get in my car when I heard it. The sound of laughter, high-pitched and eerie, echoed from the woods. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, like a distorted echo of a person's laughter, but not quite human. The kind of laugh that felt wrong, like something straight out of a horror story. I froze, my heart racing as the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling silence. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, the laughter erupted again, louder this time. It morphed into a blend of laughter and screams, a chilling cacophony that sent adrenaline flooding through my body. I glanced toward the trees, straining to see any movement, but the darkness swallowed everything. The sound was undeniably human, but distorted, as if someone were mimicking a laugh in a way that was meant to frighten. I'd been in that area enough to know the sounds of wildlife. The cries of foxes or coyotes could never compare to this. This was deliberate. I turned and bolted for my car, the keys jangling in my hand as I fumbled to unlock the door. Panic flooded my senses, and I scrambled inside, locking the doors as quickly as I could. My heart raced in sync with my thoughts, replaying the snow angel and the chilling laughter over and over. I started the engine. The familiar sound of the vehicle brought me a momentary sense of relief, but that was short-lived. With my heart still racing, I peeled away from the old building, the tires crunching on the fresh snow as I drove down the hill. The unsettling experience played over in my mind. How could someone have made that snow angel right beneath my window? So close that they must have been watching me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white as I navigated the winding road. The cold air rushed in through the cracks, biting at my skin, but I hardly noticed. My mind was too occupied with the haunting laughter still echoing in my ears. As I drove, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, just a flicker of something dark and quick darting among the trees. I could feel the panic swell again. Was it just my imagination? I forced myself to breathe steadily, reminding myself that it was just the shadows of the trees playing tricks in the night. But deep down I knew there was something more sinister lurking beyond the light. I kept the radio on, the music filling the silence with a semblance of normalcy, but the words barely registered. I thought about calling my boss, asking if he had heard or seen anything strange, but what could I possibly say? Hey, I think someone is stalking me in the snow. It sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. Instead, I focused on the road, trying to shake off the tension building in my chest. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced at my phone, half expecting a notification, anything to distract me from the chill that gripped my heart. The snow continued to fall gently, creating a serene blanket over everything. But I knew better. That peaceful scene hid something terrifying, something that seemed to watch and wait. The thought made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight. Once I got home, I parked my SUV and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the safety of my childhood home wrapping around me like a warm blanket. But I couldn't escape the vivid image of the snow angel and that eerie laugh. It was now a part of me, a haunting reminder of the night's events. I turned on the lights in the living room, trying to drown out the creeping shadows, and made a mental note to share the story with my family in the morning. As I settled onto the couch, the rain sounds pattering against the windows began to relax me a bit. Almost like a sleep aid, I thought about how, despite the horror stories and scary tales I had grown up with, nothing could compare to the true stories that unfolded right before my eyes. There was something unsettling about this experience, something that would stick with me long after the snow melted and the laughter faded. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made me jump, my heart racing as I remembered the unsettling laughter and the snow angel. The shadows in my room felt alive, creeping and stretching as the wind howled outside. I tried to distract myself with thoughts of my upcoming graduate school plans, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that imprint in the snow, perfectly crafted and undeniably sinister. As dawn broke, I reluctantly pulled myself from the couch, my body aching from the tension of the night before. The light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow that did little to chase away the chill I felt inside. I decided to share what happened with my parents over breakfast. They always had a way of calming my nerves and helping me regain my sense of security. "Did you hear that laughter last night?" I asked, pouring coffee into my mug, trying to sound casual but failing. My mother looked up from her cooking, her brow furrowed. "What laughter?" she replied, concern creeping into her voice. I explained the events of the night before, from the snow angel to the eerie laughter that had echoed through the trees. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, while my mother looked genuinely worried. "You should have called us," she said softly, her voice tinged with motherly concern. "You never know what could be out there." My father shrugged, dismissing it as just an overactive imagination. "You're just tired from working late, that's all," he said, attempting to reassure me, but his words didn't ease the tension knotting my stomach. I found it hard to focus on the conversation, my thoughts racing back to that chilling night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finished my breakfast in silence, my mind swirling with questions I couldn't answer. Later that afternoon, I decided to go back to the office. I had to confront the unsettling memories and see if there was any evidence left of what happened. I parked my SUV outside, the old building looming before me, its structure familiar yet alien after the previous night's events. As I stepped inside, the air felt thick with anticipation. I climbed the creaky stairs, ready to confront the remnants of the previous night. The office was just as I left it, papers scattered across the desk under the flickering light. I opened the window to let in the fresh air, hoping it would chase away the lingering unease. I glanced out toward the snowy ground, where my heart sank. The snow had melted slightly, but I could still see the outline of the angel lingering in the fading light. It was a haunting reminder of the night's terror, a perfect snow angel carved by unseen hands. Despite the fading sunlight, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was heavy, the only sound the rain tapping against the windows like a sinister lullaby. I was caught between the desire to leave and the need to stay and understand what had happened. This experience was no longer just a scary compilation of events. It had become a part of me, a true horror story that blurred the lines between reality and the surreal. As I made my way to the door, a sudden gust of wind blew through the open window, rattling the papers on my desk. I turned to look back one last time, the angel's outline almost glowing in the dim light. And that was when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of laughter, echoing from the woods, chilling my very bones. This time I wasn't sure if I could run fast enough to escape it. Are you feeling trapped by your own mind? like the walls of your dorm are closing in on you? In this video, I'll reveal the shocking story of a haunted college room that led one student down a dark path of despair. If you don't face your inner demons, you might miss out on the crucial steps to reclaim your mental health. Stick around to discover how confronting the past can unlock your future. I never thought a small women's college tucked away in a quaint New England town would become the backdrop for my own horror story. When I got the chance to live in one of the oldest dorms on campus, affectionately called the Castle, I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. The building, with its ivy-clad walls and twisting turrets, felt like something out of a Gothic novel. And at 19, I was ready for the romantic adventure I believed awaited me. But as I would soon learn, sometimes the stories we tell ourselves can take a dark turn. Settling into my new room was a thrill. Sure, it was the smallest space in the building, but I was just happy to be there. The stone walls had a chill that felt comforting rather than oppressive. I imagined myself writing my own scary tales, inspired by the creaks and groans of the ancient structure. My friends and I joked about the rumors of ghost sightings, but I didn't take them seriously. They were just college legends, after all. I filled my days with classes and laughter, feeling as if I had truly found my place. But soon, the feeling of doom began creeping in. What started as occasional sadness turned into an all-consuming darkness. Every night, after the lights were out and my friends had left, that heaviness settled around me like a suffocating blanket. I would sit on my bed, tears streaming down my cheeks, overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness that I couldn't shake. Despite my straight-A grades and the support of loved ones, I felt utterly alone. The walls of my room seemed to whisper, drowning out all the joy I had known. I started skipping classes and turning down invitations, isolating myself further. The more I withdrew, the more intense my despair became. My friends tried to reach out, suggesting counseling, but I brushed off their concerns. I told myself that I was just going through a rough patch, that I'd bounce back soon enough. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The internal struggle was becoming unbearable, and I started to entertain dangerous thoughts as a means of coping. One night, as the rain sounds pattered against my window, I sat on my bed, books scattered around me. I tried to study, but the tears kept coming, each drop a reminder of the pain I was trying to escape. And then, in that haze of despair, I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I saw her, a girl sitting at the edge of my bed, her back to me. Brown hair fell in waves down her back, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of connection. But when she turned to face me, the expression on her face twisted my stomach. Her eyes held a feral anger, her mouth contorted in a snarl. It felt like a warning, a message that something dreadful was lurking in the shadows of my mind. That moment was like a jolt to my system. I leaped from the bed, my heart racing, the sound of my own breathing drowned out by the pounding of rain against the window. I was alone, at least I thought I was, but the oppressive energy in the room suggested otherwise. I didn't know what to make of the girl I had just seen. Was she a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of my inner turmoil? The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and I was terrified of what it meant. I stumbled out of my room, desperate for air, the hallway dimly lit by flickering lights that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my anxiety. The laughter and chatter of other students felt like a distant echo, reminding me of what I was missing out on. I made my way to the RS room, each step heavy with dread. It was time to talk about what was happening to me, to open up about the darkness I had tried so hard to hide. But would she understand? Would anyone? When I knocked on her door, the sound felt like a hammer against the silence. She opened it with a warm smile, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of my secrets pressing down on me. I started to share everything: the sadness, the isolation, the desperate thoughts that had crept in like uninvited guests. As I spoke, I glanced back toward my room, half expecting to see the girl sitting there, waiting for me to return. But the only thing I felt was the lingering heaviness that had come to define my nights. To my surprise, the RA listened intently. After I finished, she hesitated before revealing the history of my room. "You might want to know that the girl who lived there before you had a tragic story," she said gently. She was bullied by her classmates and, unfortunately, took her own life in that very bed. Her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The sadness I had been feeling wasn't just mine. It felt as if it had seeped into the walls of the castle, intertwining with my own despair. I left the RS room, shaken but also relieved. Talking about my struggles felt like lifting a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. Yet, I couldn't shake the image of the girl from my mind. Had I truly seen her, or was she just another part of my crumbling mental state? The rain sounds outside transformed into a cacophony of whispers, reminding me of the stories I had read about haunted places and the spirits that lingered. I started to think that maybe my own horror stories weren't so far removed from reality after all. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the girl was still somehow part of my life. I threw myself into classes and social activities, but each time I returned to my room, the oppressive darkness would engulf me again. The moment I stepped inside, it felt as though I was stepping back into a shadow I couldn't escape. The slightest creak of the old building sent my heart racing, reminding me that I was not alone in this gothic nightmare. I found myself looking for signs, anything that might explain the connection I felt to the girl. Maybe I was being haunted, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I spent hours researching the history of the college, reading about its early years and the students who had lived and suffered there. The more I learned, the more the rain sounds outside my window seemed to echo the weeping of those who had come before me. I discovered that my room had been a refuge for students who were marginalized, forced to serve others while enduring the harshest of treatments. It felt like a curse wrapped in history, and I was now a part of it. My friends began to notice my increasingly erratic behavior. They were concerned and urged me to talk to a counselor. I resisted at first, fearing that doing so would make the haunting of my mind more real. Yet, the girl's image kept flashing before me, especially at night when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to drift into sleep. I closed my eyes tightly, willing her to disappear, but every time, she was right there, snarling at me, as if daring me to acknowledge the pain I was refusing to confront. One night, as I sat on my bed, staring into the dark, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't let this spiral any further. The image of the girl had become more than a haunting. It had turned into a call for help. I needed to face whatever this was, so I picked up my phone and dialed the counseling center, feeling a mix of fear and relief wash over me. Talking about my feelings seemed the only way to banish the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. I booked an appointment for the next day, hoping it would finally offer me a glimpse of light. When I lay down that night, the weight of the day pressed against my chest. The rain sounds outside had turned into a steady drumming, almost like a heartbeat. As I drifted into sleep, I felt a strange calmness, as if I was finally ready to confront my demons. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the girl returned, eyes ablaze with rage. This time she pointed at me, and a chill ran down my spine. It was a stark reminder that I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. I was intertwined with the narratives of those who had suffered before me, and if I didn't address my pain, I might end up just like her. The next day felt like an eternity as I waited for my appointment at the counseling center. I could hardly concentrate on anything, my mind racing back to the girl and the chilling sensation of her presence. Every moment felt like I was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from plunging into darkness. As I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other students, I realized I was not the only one carrying a burden. It was a sobering thought that made my heart ache but also relieved me slightly. I wasn't alone in my struggle. When my turn came, I walked into the small, cozy office and sat down, my palms sweaty. The counselor was warm and inviting, her demeanor easing my nerves as she asked me to share what had brought me there. I took a deep breath and laid it all out, my feelings of hopelessness, the self-harm, and finally, the haunting image of the girl from my room. As I spoke, I felt a release I hadn't experienced before. Each word pulled a bit more weight from my soul, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was sinking. As I opened up, the counselor listened attentively, nodding and understanding. She didn't dismiss my experience with the girl. Instead, She helped me connect the dots between my struggles and the emotional residue left in the room. "It sounds like you've been carrying a heavy weight, both from your own feelings and the history of that space," she said gently. "It's essential to process your emotions, but it's also crucial to let go of the past that doesn't belong to you." Her words resonated deeply, like an echo in the hollow of my heart. After our session, I walked back to the castle, but this time, it felt different. The air was still thick with history, but I no longer felt suffocated by it. I resolved to confront the darkness that had claimed my room and my mind. I returned to my space and, instead of cowering in fear, I sat on the bed and spoke aloud, addressing the girl who had haunted me. "I see you," I said. "I understand your pain. I don't want to feel like this anymore. I want to break this cycle." I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle lightness as if my declaration had lifted a fog. That night the rain sounds continued, but instead of a reminder of sorrow, they became a soothing lullaby. I climbed into bed, determined to reclaim my space. As I drifted into sleep, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over me. I could still see the girl in my mind, but she no longer appeared menacing. Instead, she looked back at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding, as if she too was ready to let go. I awoke the next morning refreshed, free of the overwhelming weight I had carried for so long. From that day on, I began to write. I started capturing my experiences, my feelings, and the stories of those who had come before me. They became my true Halloween horror stories, narratives that, rather than chaining me to the past, liberated me. I no longer feared the darkness. Instead, I found strength in my journey, a reminder that even the scariest tales can lead to healing and hope. I learned that true horror lies not in the ghosts of our past, but in the silence that keeps us from facing our truths. What if a Halloween night filled with innocent fun turned into a terrifying encounter that no one saw coming? In this video, we unveil a shocking true story about a haunted house that became a dangerous trap for unsuspecting kids. If you think your Halloween is safe, you might want to think again. Missing this could mean risking your family's safety. Stay tuned as we reveal the chilling details that will change how you view Halloween forever. Halloween in the 80s was a different world. The streets buzzed with the shrieks of kids in costumes and the sound of rustling leaves. I was the oldest at 13, responsible for taking my 2 younger brothers and 2 little boys from my parents' friends out for trick-or-treating. My parents and theirs were back at the house playing cards, smoke curling in the air like ghosts, and I was left to babysit these 4 pint-sized monsters. They didn't seem to grasp how unfair it was. I had babysitting duties while they got to run wild. The bitterness brewed inside me like a cauldron. It wasn't just that I missed out on trick-or-treating with my friends. It was also the repetitive cycle of chores that came with being the oldest girl in the house. I had to cook, clean, and do laundry while they got to enjoy the night. As we rounded the corner of our street, the rain began to patter softly, creating a rhythmic backdrop, almost soothing enough to make me forget my frustrations. Yet, the thrill of Halloween still hung in the air, and I clung to it like a life raft. Our route was limited to just 3 blocks, sensible for a school night. We made our way down one side and back up the other, laughter and shouts mingling with the rain sounds. Most houses on our street were identical. I knew their layouts as well as my own bedroom. As we approached a particularly dreary house, the old woman who lived there loomed in my memory. She never gave out candy, but recently she had been renting her basement to a guy who was often unfriendly. Still, he was nicer to my brothers than to me. The kids were buzzing with excitement as we reached the house. To my surprise, the men outside were setting up a folding table with a notebook on it. They greeted us with an unusual offer. There were no treats, but they were giving away prizes for anyone brave enough to enter their haunted house. My heart raced at the thought. Pocket knives, baseball cards, and even a BB gun for the grand prize. The boys from school showed up, eager to know more. Their interest piqued. I had to admit, even I felt a thrill of excitement as they recited the prizes. It seemed too good to be true. But then, just as I thought we might join in on the fun, one of the men declared, "Girls aren't allowed." A wave of laughter erupted from the boys. and my cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The kids I was supposed to be looking after joined in on the taunts, and I could feel the humiliation wash over me. I was done being a second-class citizen to these boys. I had a sudden urge to flip the table over and ruin their little operation. Instead, I hatched a plan. If I couldn't win a prize, then no one would. I would take that notebook with all the boys' names and shove it into the sewer drain by the curb. I took a deep breath to calm the rising anger and gathered my thoughts as another group of boys from my street strolled by. They were all boisterous, without a care in the world, just like we used to be. I explained the situation, and they quickly filled out their names and information in the notebook, eager for a shot at the prizes. I watched, a sly smile creeping across my face as I realized how easy it would be to erase their chances. They didn't even know what I had planned. As they laughed and bragged about how brave they were, I fell behind. My heart raced in anticipation. I had seen the basement entrance before. I knew the layout of the house well enough. I could picture the stairs leading down to the dark, cramped space where all the fun would supposedly happen. But I had no intention of going in. My goal was the notebook. As the group of boys disappeared around the side of the house, I made my move. In a flash, I grabbed the notebook and dashed to the curb. My heart pounded in my chest as I yanked open the sewer drain and shoved it inside. I felt a sense of satisfaction washing over me. I sprinted down the street, laughing with the boys about their grand adventure, hiding my secret delight. As we walked home, I could hear the rain tapping against my jacket, each drop punctuating my sense of triumph. I had successfully ruined their chances at winning anything. It felt like justice for all those times I had been left out and overlooked. The next day at school, however, everything changed. The boys who had visited the haunted house were buzzing with excitement, claiming they were going to win prizes. But as I walked through the halls, I felt a knot in my stomach, an unsettling dread creeping in. I kept waiting for someone to find out what I had done. My satisfaction slowly twisted into anxiety as the day dragged on. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming just beyond the corner. By mid-morning, our teacher was called out of the room, leaving a chilling silence in her absence. When she returned, her expression was grave. One by one, the boys were summoned to the office, and whispers filled the room. I tried to brush it off, but the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Then a boy returned from the office, eyes wide, face pale. "Did you hear?" he exclaimed, his voice shaky. "Jimmy got attacked." The world around me spun as he recounted the horror of what had happened. The news rippled through our classroom like a bad joke, but there was no laughter. I sat frozen at my desk, trying to process the chaos unfolding around me. Jimmy had been snatched at school. He was small but quick, the fastest runner in our grade. I could see him sprinting away from the kidnapper. The panic etched across his face as he darted through the alleyways. My heart raced, not out of fear for him, but because I knew he had visited the haunted house. I felt sick thinking about how my actions had played a role in all of this. Each boy called to the office had a connection to that night, a thread tying them to the nightmare. I couldn't help but worry that the police would connect my involvement somehow. Every time they returned, looking nervous and whispering, I held my breath. The teacher seemed different too. She moved with an urgency I'd never seen before. It was as if the very air in the room had shifted, thickened with dread. Then it happened. A police officer walked in, tall and imposing, and the room fell silent. He scanned our faces, and for a moment, I felt the heat of his gaze on me. I squirmed in my seat, trying to blend into the desk. "Boys, we need to talk to you about the haunted house and the notebook," he said, his voice low and steady. My pulse quickened. The fear that gripped my chest was real. I was no longer just a bystander. I was implicated in something dark and twisted. As the questioning continued, I tried to maintain my composure. Boys were called one by one, and whispers flew back and forth like sparks. They spoke of the notebook, how it had contained vital information, giving the perpetrators a guide to who would be home alone after school. My heart sank. I hadn't just ruined their chance at winning prizes. I had inadvertently opened a door to a threat I hadn't fully understood. As the clock ticked away, I was consumed by guilt and dread. When the officer finally called me, I stood and walked toward him, feeling every eye in the room on my back. I was about to step into a world where my secret could unravel. As I recounted my experience, I felt the weight of the notebook heavy on my conscience. "I didn't think it was dangerous," I stammered. "I just wanted to teach them a lesson." The words hung in the air, and I could see the officer's eyes narrow in suspicion. I knew this could go very wrong. Days turned into weeks, and life in our neighborhood felt suffocated by the looming threat. The police continued their investigation, and whispers about the haunted house faded into fearful silence. Parents were on high alert, and our small town buzzed with unease. I avoided my classmates, especially those who'd been at the haunted house. The burden of my secret weighed heavily on my shoulders, a silent reminder of my reckless decision. I couldn't shake the feeling that my actions had consequences far beyond what I'd imagined. At home, the atmosphere was tense. My parents, usually so engrossed in their own lives, had grown increasingly vigilant. They started checking locks and closing curtains, their casual nonchalance replaced by paranoia. I spent many evenings alone, letting the rain sounds outside blend with my thoughts, drowning in a sea of what-ifs. The laughter from the boys during Halloween haunted me. I had hoped to make them feel what I felt less than, belittled, but now I realized the true horror of my actions. What if something had happened to them? One afternoon, while I was cleaning up the living room, the doorbell rang. My heart raced as I looked out the window. A police officer stood on the porch talking to my parents. I felt like I was trapped in a horror story, the kind that kept me up at night, reliving every moment of that fateful Halloween. I had thought my secret was safe, but dread crept in. The officer's visit was either a formality or a prelude to something far more sinister. My palms grew sweaty as I waited, the room closing in around me. After what felt like an eternity, my parents called me into the living room. The officer glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "We have reason to believe the individuals from the haunted house may be connected to other incidents in the area," he said, his tone serious. "We want you to be aware of the situation and to stay safe. If you hear anything unusual, report it immediately." My stomach twisted. I knew I was part of that equation, and now I couldn't escape the reality of my part in the horror that unfolded. As the weeks rolled on, the reality of Sharon's death hit me like a freight train. I tried to push the nagging guilt away, but it settled in like a dark cloud. She had brought joy into our home, transforming mundane days into colorful adventures. Now, her absence loomed over me like a shadow, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. But the secret of the notebook remained buried deep within me. Each day that passed felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to a revelation I couldn't bear to face. In the end, Halloween was a reminder of the thin line between joy and horror, innocence and guilt. I had entered the night as a girl hoping to carve out a piece of fun, but emerged with the weight of responsibility and the scars of a chilling experience. Each Halloween that followed carried with it the memory of that night, a quiet caution whispering in the back of my mind. I had learned too late that actions have consequences, and sometimes the true horror lies not in the monsters lurking in the shadows, but in the choices we make in the light. What if one night changed everything you thought you knew about fear? In this video, I'll share a spine-chilling true story about an eerie encounter that will leave you questioning reality itself. If you think you can handle the truth, stay tuned, because this experience reshaped my understanding of what lurks in the dark. And in know, it I'm real. That it might just do the same for you. Growing up in the thick of southern Appalachia, I was never one to believe in the old folk tales. My friends spun tales of ghosts, witches, and strange happenings in the woods, but they were just stories, right? I thought I'd seen everything my small town had to offer, especially after moving out of my parents' house at 16. That's when I met him. He was charming and rebellious, the type who could make an adventure out of nothing. That Halloween night, we decided to chase a meteor shower and set off to the river, completely unaware of the dread waiting for us. We cruised down the winding mountain roads in his black Honda Civic, music blasting to drown out the eerie stillness that hung in the air. As we made our way toward the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the darkness was pressing down on us. The gravel road led us through thick trees, their twisted branches casting strange shadows in our headlights. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking about the amazing view we'd get of the meteors. After all, I had been to this river 100 times and nothing ever happened. But then we saw it. In the middle of the road stood a massive black dog. Not a wolf or any local stray, but a creature that looked almost like a Great Dane. Its fur was as dark as the night itself. My heart raced as I realized there were no houses around. How could a dog like that just be here? It stood unmoving, illuminated by our headlights, its posture unnervingly tense. My boyfriend pressed the brakes and we both stared, caught in the moment. "Maybe it's lost," he suggested, but his voice held an edge of uncertainty. I could feel the unease creeping in, like a shadow reaching out to grab me. I wanted to tell him to back away, to turn around, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my throat. Instead, we slowly edged closer, and the dog didn't budge. It just stared. I was practically frozen in my seat, feeling as though its eyes were boring into my soul. They were a piercing yellow, and I felt a chill run down my spine. With a deep breath, he decided to go around it. The car creaked as he turned the wheel, moving off the gravel road to circumvent this black behemoth. I was still staring out the passenger window, my heart racing as I glanced into those dreadful eyes, level with me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. It was as if this creature knew me, my fears, and my discomfort. The moment felt endless as we crept past it, the darkness swallowing the creature the moment we drove by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching. We finally reached the river, but I refused to get out of the car. My boyfriend was eager to watch the meteors fall, but I was gripped by an all-consuming dread. The night had turned cold, and the shadows loomed larger than before. As I peered through the sunroof, hoping to catch a glimpse of the sky, all I could feel was that gaze, the weight of those unblinking eyes. The meteors streaked overhead, but they seemed to pale in comparison to the lingering fear that washed over me. It was a night of cosmic beauty, tainted by a primal terror I couldn't understand. Sitting in that car, I felt a suffocating sense of unease wrap around me like a thick fog. The air was charged, not just from the meteor shower overhead, but from something else, a heavy silence that pressed down on my chest. My boyfriend laughed, pointing out the bright trails shooting across the sky, but I couldn't join him. I was still haunted by that dog, its yellow eyes seared into my memory. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, glancing over at me with concern. I nodded, but I knew my unease was evident. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. But the truth was, I felt more than tired. I felt exposed. The woods around us whispered secrets in the wind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the tree line. As the last meteor fell, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. My heart raced. I quickly turned my gaze back to the sky, focusing on the dying stars rather than the shadows closing in around us. After a while, we decided to head back. My boyfriend turned the car around, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me as we left the river behind. But that relief was short-lived. The moment we hit the winding road back up the mountain, an overwhelming chill filled the car, and my thoughts drifted back to the dog. "Did you see how big that thing was?" I asked, trying to bring the conversation back to normalcy. "Yeah, it was huge, almost like it didn't belong there," he replied, his voice trailing off. The road felt longer this time, and every twist and turn made my stomach tighten. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to grasp the car as we sped past. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that creature bounding after us. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind us. Still, the nagging sense of being followed didn't leave. I was aware of every sound, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the low hum of the engine. Yet nothing felt right. As we crested the mountain, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "You're quiet," he said, glancing at me sideways. I shrugged, unsure how to put my feelings into words. The reality was that I felt shaken. That dog, it was just strange, I finally admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. Maybe he didn't have to. Some things can't be explained. The night had been a blend of beauty and fear, and I felt the latter overshadowing the former. When we finally reached the foot of the mountain, the tension in the car eased just a little, but I still felt on edge. The familiar streets of my town brought a strange comfort, yet they felt tainted somehow. Want to grab a bite to eat? My boyfriend suggested, but I shook my head. I just want to go home. I needed to be alone, to process what had happened. The encounter with that creature clung to me like a second skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed the house was dark. My parents had gone out for the night, leaving me to navigate this unsettling experience alone. Climbing the stairs to my room, I was acutely aware of the silence. I slipped into bed, but sleep felt like a distant dream. My mind kept racing, replaying the night's events like a horror movie on repeat. I turned on the radio to drown out my thoughts, the soft sounds of late-night music filling the room. But then came the rain. The steady patter against my window echoed the dread building in my chest. I couldn't help but think back to that dog, its unyielding stare, those yellow eyes that seemed to penetrate my very being. It was just a dog, I reminded myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had meant something more. I pulled the blankets closer around me, trying to shield myself from the chill of both the night and my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a low growl. My heart skipped a beat as I shot up in bed, peering through the rain-streaked window. All I could see were the silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind, their branches casting eerie shapes on the ground. I strained to listen, feeling a sense of terror creeping in. I wanted to convince myself it was just the rain, maybe a distant dog barking. But deep down, I knew that the sound felt too close, too intentional. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my boyfriend. He answered groggily, but when I told him about the noise, I could hear the concern in his voice. Maybe it's just a stray dog, he suggested, but I could sense he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I don't think so, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The growling had stopped, but I felt like it was just waiting for the right moment to return. Just keep your doors locked, okay? He said, and I hung up, feeling even more isolated than before. As I lay back down, I wrapped my arms around myself, wishing for the comfort of sleep. But the darkness pressed in, heavy and oppressive. I tried to breathe through it, listening to the rhythmic sounds of the rain. But every drop felt like a reminder of that dog, lurking in the shadows. Sleep eluded me, and as the night wore on, I felt the weight of something unseen bearing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The rain continued its relentless dance against the window, each drop merging into the next, creating a symphony of unease. I spent the hours tossing and turning, haunted by memories of that night and the lurking shadows outside. As dawn approached, I finally surrendered to a fitful sleep, but my dreams were riddled with images of the black dog, its yellow eyes staring into my soul, demanding acknowledgement. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the remnants of my dreams swirling in my mind like ghosts refusing to let go. By morning, the rain had subsided, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the ground. As I made my way downstairs, the familiar sounds of my house felt oddly comforting. My parents were still gone, and I was left alone to contemplate the previous night's events. I forced myself to eat breakfast, trying to regain some normalcy, but with every crunch of cereal my mind drifted back to that dog, to the way it had looked right through me. Determined to shake the feeling of dread, I decided to call my boyfriend and meet up with him. Let's just hang out, maybe go for a drive or something, I suggested, desperate for distraction. He agreed, and soon enough I was in his car rolling down familiar roads, but every turn felt heavy with the weight of my experience. You all right? He asked, glancing over at me. I forced a smile, masking the turmoil beneath. Just a little tired, I replied, unsure how to convey the fear that still lingered. We drove toward the river again, the sun breaking through the clouds as if to wash away the remnants of last night's shadows. Yet, as we approached the access road, my heart began to race. You sure about this? I hesitated, recalling the darkness that had swallowed us whole. He nodded, confident in his decision. Let's just check it out. Maybe it was nothing. I wanted to believe him, to think that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, a voice warned me that this was a mistake. Pulling up to the spot where we had seen the dog, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sun illuminated the area, casting away the night's shadows, but my fear felt alive, gnawing at my insides. As we stepped out of the car, the air felt electric. We walked toward the riverbank, where the water glistened in the daylight. "See? It's beautiful," he said, trying to lift my spirits. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just out of sight. We stood at the edge of the river, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement, a flash of black in the underbrush. My heart pounded as I turned to look, and there it was again, that same black shape, low and massive, almost indistinguishable from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I could see the yellow eyes staring back at me, unblinking. It felt as if the world had stopped. And in that moment I realized that some things aren't meant to be explained. Some things just are. As I faced that creature once more, I felt an odd calm wash over me, mixed with an overwhelming sense of dread. I stood frozen, no longer afraid of the shadows, but rather of what I might learn about myself. My boyfriend turned to me, confusion written all over his face, but I simply shook my head, understanding that this was something I had to confront alone. And as the dog stared back at me, I couldn't help but feel a connection and understanding that this encounter was more than just an odd coincidence. It was a lesson in facing the darkness within, and with that realization I turned away, leaving the river behind, knowing that whatever lingered in the shadows, I would carry it with me as part of my story, a reminder that some truths are scarier than fiction. Imagine living in a peaceful beach town, only to wake up one night to a bloody scream outside your door. That's exactly what happened to us. This video will take you through the spine-chilling events of that night, revealing how a simple evening turned into a terrifying nightmare. If you think your neighborhood is safe, stay tuned, because you won't believe the dark secrets lurking just outside your window. Moving to a small beach town had been a dream come true for me and my family. It was peaceful, quiet, and filled with friendly faces. We settled in 4 years ago, and after the bustle of city life, the slower pace felt like a breath of fresh air. Neighbors waved hello as they walked their dogs along the shore, and we even started sharing backyard barbecues. But there was something lurking beneath the surface, something that made me question how idyllic our little slice of paradise really was. The town had its dark corners, people slumped behind the wheel of their cars, the remnants of a drug problem we'd all heard rumors about. One evening, as Halloween approached, the town was wrapped in that familiar autumn chill. I found myself reminiscing about the last time the air had felt this eerie. I glanced out the window, the sky clouding over, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It all started when a neighbor knocked on my door late one night, pulling me out of my thoughts. She was visibly shaken, her face pale under the flickering streetlight. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I thought she was overreacting. "What are you talking about?" I replied, half convinced it was just the Halloween festivities getting to her. But Mary, the no-nonsense neighbor, insisted that something had happened. Apparently, she'd heard booming noises echoing through the night, shaking her windows and rattling her nerves. I tried to reassure her, but as I listened to her recount the events, an uneasy feeling crept in. What was making those sounds? And why hadn't I heard anything? Mary described how she thought it was just artillery testing from the nearby military base. But as the night wore on, the booms grew louder. She had turned on the lights, expecting it to stop, only to discover that the noise shifted to her front door. She got up to investigate, and in her own words, it was like something straight out of a horror story. I felt a chill run down my spine, especially when she said she saw movement outside. As she spoke, I could see that Mary was still processing what had happened. "I thought I was imagining it," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked past her, toward the shadows creeping along the street, and wondered if something truly unsettling was at play. After all, we lived in a town where strange things seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. And then, just as she finished her story, I heard an echoing boom, shaking the very foundation of my home. It sent a wave of panic through me. Was this a Halloween prank, or was something much darker stirring in the night? I hadn't felt fear like that in years, yet as I listened to Mari's account, my pulse quickened. The air was thick with tension, and the booming noise reverberated in my mind. "I'll go check," I finally said, my voice shaky. But before I could grab my jacket, Ron, another neighbor from down the block, appeared, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Did you hear the noise?" he asked, eyes darting between Mary and me. I nodded, feeling the weight of dread settle in my stomach. Mary had described how the sounds had shifted from her windows to her front door, and my thoughts raced as Ron recounted his experience. "It sounded like something was banging on my window too," he said. At first I thought it was just kids messing around, but then his voice trailed off, and I could see the unease creeping into his expression. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night air had grown still, a heavy silence replacing the noise, but it didn't comfort me. I stepped outside, the chill seeping into my bones, and glanced up at the dark sky. Clouds had rolled in, blocking out the moonlight, casting our street into an unsettling gloom. "What if it's just a prank?" I suggested, trying to rationalize the situation, though deep down I felt it was something more sinister. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again, a loud, deliberate knock that resonated from the direction of Mary's house. "Did you hear that?" I gasped, glancing at Ron and Mary, who exchanged wary glances. "It's coming from her front door," I shouted, my heart racing as we hurried back. The booming was getting louder, and just as we approached Mary's porch, I noticed something smeared across her front window. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. It looked like dirt. No, it was darker than that. Mary stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I thought it was mud," she murmured, her voice thick with dread. "But now it looks like blood." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I stared at the gruesome sight. Just then, the pounding at the door escalated, each knock reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. Mary's instincts kicked in. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "They're back! They're trying to break in!" she shouted, her voice shaky but resolute. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I realized how serious this was becoming. A moment later, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the shadowy figure of a woman, her features obscured by the darkness. "Help me! Help me!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "They've taken my kids and are eating my face." The words sent chills down my spine, each syllable echoing in the still night air. What had we stumbled into? The woman's screams echoed in the night, a chilling sound that felt out of place in our quiet beach town. "Do not open that door," Mary shouted, panic clear in her voice. But Mike, her husband, stood frozen, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. The woman continued to pound on the door, her voice rising in pitch. "They're eating my face. Help me, please. Get back," Ron shouted, stepping protectively in front of Mary. The sight of the woman was unsettling. Her clothes were tattered, soaked in what I now recognized as blood, and her long hair hung in matted clumps, sticking to her forehead as if she had just emerged from a nightmare. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to hide, but I was rooted to the spot, captivated by the horror unfolding before us. Mike finally seemed to snap out of it, stepping forward cautiously, but not without a hint of bravado. "What happened? Who did this to you?" he demanded, his voice a mix of authority and concern. But the woman's eyes were wild, darting around as if she were trapped in a frantic nightmare. "They're coming! You don't understand. They're everywhere," she cried, clawing at the door as though trying to break free from an unseen threat. Mary's voice trembled as she spoke to the 911 operator. "You have to send someone. There's a woman at my door, and she's covered in blood." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. The operator's calm response only fueled my anxiety. "Ma'am, we're aware of the situation. Please remain indoors and keep your doors locked," they said, as if the mere act of locking our doors could protect us from the chaos outside. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the screams from the woman turned into sobs, her voice breaking with despair. "Help me! They're trying to take my children." Her pleas pierced through the darkness, a haunting reminder that our idyllic beach town was not as safe as we believed. The shadows felt alive, creeping closer as if drawn to her pain. and I felt an unsettling mix of pity and terror for this woman. "Why aren't the cops doing anything?" Ron muttered under his breath, his frustration palpable. "What's wrong with them?" I glanced at Mary, who was now on the verge of tears, torn between fear for her own safety and concern for the woman outside. The pounding on the door persisted, and with every knock, I could feel the walls of our reality crumbling, revealing the unsettling truth lurking beneath our quiet lives. Just when it felt like the night couldn't get any worse, the door swung open. Mike, with a mix of bravado and disbelief, decided to confront the nightmare head-on. As he pulled the door ajar, the woman stumbled inside, her face a mask of terror and desperation. "They're coming for me," she screamed, her bloodied hands reaching out as if to grasp at salvation. The sight of her only heightened the panic swirling in my chest. "Shut the door," Mary shouted, but it was too late. The woman rushed in, her wild eyes scanning the room, as if she were trying to find a place to hide from unseen monsters. "They're going to eat us. They're everywhere." Her voice cracked, echoing the chaos that had invaded our quiet lives. We all froze, the weight of her words crashing down on us like a tidal wave. Ron stepped back, his expression a mixture of shock and horror. "We need to call the cops again," he yelled. But before he could reach for his phone, the woman collapsed to the floor, her body trembling as she curled into a ball. "Please," she sobbed, "help me." The blood that had soaked her clothes was now smearing onto our hardwood floor, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the peace of our beach town. Mary instinctively rushed to her side, her nurturing instincts kicking in despite the fear coursing through her veins. "It's okay, you're safe now. We'll help you." But even as she spoke those words, I could see the doubt in her eyes. Who were we really helping? This woman, lost in her torment, or ourselves, desperate to regain control over the chaos that had upended our lives? Moments felt like hours as we awaited the arrival of law enforcement. Outside, the sounds of sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. It was a bittersweet relief, knowing help was finally on the way, but also realizing that our lives would never be the same again. The woman, now sobbing uncontrollably, whispered about shadows lurking in the night and the darkness that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something that wasn't there. When the sheriff finally arrived, the chaos outside seemed to quiet, but the tension in our small home remained palpable. As they entered, we could see the skepticism in their eyes. They had dealt with countless situations like this, but this was different. This time we were not mere spectators. We were caught in a story that was all too real. The officers quickly took control of the situation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. As the night wore on, we learned that the woman was indeed a local, someone whose life had spiraled into darkness due to the pervasive drug problem in our neighborhood. As the officers escorted her away, her final words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can hide beneath the surface of even the quietest towns. "They're still out there," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "They'll come for you next." That night changed everything. We had moved to a small beach town seeking peace, but the reality of our situation had become a chilling tale of survival, one that would echo in our memories long after the sirens faded. As we sat together, sharing our shock and fear, the truth sank in. Horror stories weren't just found in books or movies. They lived right next door. Have you ever felt terrified in your own home, like something is watching you? In this video, I'll share a chilling true story of a strange encounter that changed everything for me one summer night. If you think your home is safe, you'll want to hear this. What happened might just haunt your dreams. Stick around to discover the surprising twist that left not just me, but another witness completely shaken. It was the summer I turned 11, and I was buzzing with the excitement of a big change. My parents had sold our ordinary one-story home and bought an enormous, eccentric house in a different town. The architect had crafted it using reclaimed materials, giving it a unique charm. From the outside, it looked like something out of a storybook, with rough cedar planks and antique stained glass windows imported from England. I could hardly believe it was ours. The house felt grand, a labyrinth of rooms and corners waiting to be explored. My room was massive, complete with its own bathroom and walk-in closet. The stained glass windows added a splash of color, casting pretty patterns on the walls when the sun shone through. My parents had set my bed against an inner wall facing those captivating windows. The first few nights in this new space were filled with wonder. I spent hours admiring the way the light danced across my room. Little did I know that this beautiful house would become the backdrop for one of the most terrifying nights of my life. After we moved in, my brother and I roamed the neighborhood, meeting new friends. It was an older area, rich with history and filled with stories about its residents. One day, while chatting with some kids down the street, I overheard whispers about the previous owner of our house. "Did you know the guy who built it went to jail?" One of them said, eyes wide. "He was a pervert." Another chimed in, "Your house is haunted." I laughed it off. How could a house be haunted if no one lived in it before us? Yet, unease settled in the back of my mind, lingering like a shadow. I had always loved scary stories, reveling in the thrill they provided. That summer, I read the Amityville Horror, which left me with a knot of fear in my stomach. As the days turned to nights, my vivid imagination twisted the book's tales into my reality. Every creak of the house felt amplified. The smoke alarm's red light glowed ominously in the dark, and each time I woke up to see it, thoughts of demons and monsters invaded my mind. Sleep eluded me as I lay awake, the night stretching endlessly before me. One particular night, around 2 a.m., I found myself wide awake again. I got up to use the bathroom, hoping it might calm my racing heart, but when I crawled back into bed, that familiar red glow felt like a spotlight on my fears. I stared at it, wishing I could erase the memories of that ridiculous book. Suddenly, something caught my eye. A shape moved outside my window, and I froze. There, just above the shutters, was a head peering in, as if someone was watching me from the outside. My heart raced, and every rational thought fled my mind. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my tired imagination. But the head remained there, its outline growing clearer. I could barely breathe. The window's intricate design distorted my view, making the figure appear both present and unreal. As it dipped and rose, curiosity turned to terror. I considered yelling for my parents, but what would I even say? I felt paralyzed, trapped in a silent scream. At first I thought it could be a prank, a neighbor playing a cruel joke, but as it rose above the shutters again, my mind raced through a list of possibilities. Maybe someone was on a ladder, peeking in, but that didn't make sense. No one should be able to see into my room from that height. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I watched the head rise and fall. Then it vanished completely, only to reappear at a different angle, as if whatever it was had changed position. The figure seemed to float and contort in ways that made my stomach drop. I wanted to scream, to leap out of bed and run, but my body was stuck, overwhelmed by dread. It was then I realized I could hear something faint, scratching sounds, like tiny claws running over the cedar siding of the house. Each sound sent chills down my spine, and I fought the urge to bolt. The head had no distinct features, but the shape was unmistakably human-like, with an oval head that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. Just as the panic began to consume me, my brother walked in to use the bathroom. His presence was a lifeline, breaking the trance I had been under. As soon as he stepped into my room, the figure vanished with a loud scratching noise. I screamed, and my brother jumped back, wide-eyed. "What was that?" he exclaimed, clearly shaken. The terror that had gripped me poured out in tears, and I stammered, "I don't know. I saw something." His face paled as he processed my words. "What do you mean you saw something?" He stepped closer, glancing around the room as if expecting the figure to return. I walked in, and I felt something was off. The hair on his arms stood straight up, and the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief knowing I wasn't alone. Whatever had been outside my window had also left an impression on him. We spent the rest of the night huddled in his room, where the shadows felt less oppressive. The night crept by as we whispered about what had just happened. My mind raced with questions. Was it just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination? The fear that something had invaded my space consumed me, but the comfort of having someone else there dulled the edge of the terror. Morning light broke through the stained glass, casting colorful patterns across the floor. but the beauty of the house felt hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a wet blanket. After breakfast, my brother and I stepped outside, both determined to find some semblance of an explanation for the nightmare we had shared. The neighborhood felt eerily quiet, the usual sounds of children playing muffled by an unsettling hush. We wandered around the yard, examining every inch of the house, looking for clues or signs that something might have actually been lurking outside my window. We searched for tracks, marks, or anything that could indicate a human presence, but all we found was the rough texture of the cedar planks and the overwhelming scent of damp earth from the recent rain. "There's nothing here," my brother said, frustration creeping into his voice. "It doesn't make sense." "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I suggested, although my heart didn't believe it. The image of that head reappearing, twisting into unnatural positions, haunted me. I didn't want to admit how scared I was. I had always loved scary stories, relishing the thrill of fear. But this felt too real, too personal. We both wanted answers, but none came. Instead, we felt the weight of the house, its odd architecture suddenly feeling more like a cage than a sanctuary. The rest of the day dragged on. We tried to play with the kids in the neighborhood, but the words haunted house echoed in my head. I could see the way their eyes widened when they realized where we lived. As they shared stories about the architect and his past, I found it hard to concentrate. "Did you know he went to jail?" one boy asked. "They say he built the house to hide something." Each revelation twisted the knife of fear deeper into my gut. When we returned home, I was determined to face my fears. I marched up to my room, my brother trailing behind, trying to muster courage. I needed to confront whatever had scared me so deeply. With a flashlight in hand, I checked the windows, pushing back the sheer curtains to peer outside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the scratching sounds echoed in my memory, a constant reminder that something had happened, something real. I couldn't escape it. That night, I found it hard to settle in my newly arranged bedroom. The bed was positioned between the stained glass windows, and I thought I'd feel safer there, but every little noise sent me into a panic. The rain sounds outside became a symphony of dread, each drop echoing like a ticking clock counting down to another terrifying encounter. I lay under the covers, heart racing, waiting for sleep to come and banish the day's horrors. As I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into a dark vortex of anxiety. My brother had fallen asleep, but I couldn't find comfort in the familiar presence. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, focusing on the way the light from the smoke alarm flickered. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as my eyes began to flutter, I heard it again, the faint scratching sound, just outside the window. Frozen in fear, I held my breath, listening. Was it the wind? A tree branch? Or was it something more sinister? I couldn't help but replay the events of the previous night in my mind. The face that had appeared, contorted and unnatural. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever it was wanted to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it wouldn't be real. Then, the scratching stopped. A tense silence enveloped the room, stretching into eternity. I thought about waking my brother, but something held me back. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was just being dramatic? I had to face this myself. Gathering my courage, I sat up and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, heart racing. I crept toward the window, peering out cautiously, but all I saw was the empty yard, shadows cast by the moonlight. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned away, the scratching started again, louder this time, and it felt like it was right next to me. The sound of claws scraping against wood sent my stomach lurching. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from my room and ran down the hall, seeking refuge in my brother's bed once more. The next morning, I awoke with the sun pouring through the windows, washing away the remnants of the night. My brother stirred beside me, looking confused but relieved to see me there. "What happened last night?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I hesitated, unsure if I should share the terror that still gripped me. Instead, we both pretended like nothing had occurred, pushing the memory aside. That day, we returned to our routine, but the unease lingered like a shadow. We never saw anything outside the window again, but the memory of that encounter haunted me. I rearranged my room once more, and though I couldn't completely shake the fear, I learned to live with it. In the end, the house became just that, a house. Over time, the strange happenings faded into the background, becoming a part of my childhood's scary stories. Even now, years later, I think back to that summer, to the fear that took hold of my imagination. It was one of those true Halloween horror stories that remind me of how real the fear can be. I often wonder about the architect and the secrets buried within those walls. The house, with its charming yet ominous allure, remained a beautiful but unsettling memory, a scary tale that became part of my narrative, a haunting I would carry with me long after leaving. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.